The blue and red lights of Officer Daniel Hayes' patrol car flashed across the quiet suburban street, cutting through the evening's calm like a warning. He pulled up in front of a two-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn, the kind of home where he believed trouble didn't belong, at least not the kind that usually involved people who looked like him. Daniel Hayes was known in the force for being a man who trusted his gut. His gut, however, often led him to conclusions before he even stepped out of his car. And tonight was no different. He reached for the radio. "This is Officer Hayes, responding to a possible disturbance on Willow Lane. White female caller reports a suspicious black male tampering with electrical equipment." Static crackled before dispatch responded. 10-4, proceed with caution. Hayes smirked. "Caution? Please. I already know what's going on here." He unholstered his gun, just in case, and approached the front porch where a woman in her late 40s stood, arms crossed, her face twisted in indignation. "He's right there, officer," she spat, jabbing a manicured finger toward the house next door. "He's been messing with the wires and putting up, God knows what, some kind of illegal satellite." Hayes followed her gaze. In the driveway, a tall black man stood beside a ladder, securing a sleek Starlink dish to the roof of his home. He wore a gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and an expression of mild confusion, until he noticed the cop and the angry neighbor. "Sir, step away from whatever it is you're doing. Hands where I can see them." Hayes barked, stepping forward, his hand gripping his gun. The man frowned but calmly climbed down the ladder. "Officer, what seems to be the problem?" "Problem is, you're messing with wires that aren't yours. What are you really doing here?" Hayes demanded. The man sighed. "This is my house." The woman scoffed. "That's a lie. I've lived here for 15 years, and I know the people who belong here. You just moved in last month, and you've been acting suspicious ever since." "I'm installing a Starlink dish." "It's legal," the man replied, his voice steady but firm. Hayes wasn't buying it. "How about you show me some ID? Something that proves you belong here." The man stared at him for a long moment, then reached into his back pocket. Hayes tensed, gripping his gun tighter. "Slowly," he warned. The man pulled out his wallet and handed over a driver's license. Hayes squinted at the name. Honorable Judge Malcolm Evers. The color drained from Hayes' face. A judge. Not just any judge, a federal judge. The woman's smug expression faltered. She stammered, peering at the ID over Hayes' shoulder. Hayes' mind raced. He had just threatened a federal judge. His career, his entire life, one wrong move and it could all be over. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Then, the judge took a slow step forward. "Now, Officer Hayes," he said, voice calm but laced with authority. "Would you like to explain why you came here, gun drawn, over a simple internet installation?" A bead of sweat rolled down Hayes' temple. He swallowed hard. The radio on his shoulder crackled. Then suddenly, a loud bang. Earlier that day, Willow Lane was the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other from their driveways but rarely stepped into each other's homes. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where people took pride in their gardens and gossiped over the fence. Judge Malcolm Evers had moved in just a month ago, looking for that very peace. His job was stressful enough. He spent his days deciding the fates of criminals, dealing with cases that weighed heavily on his conscience. When he wasn't in court, he wanted to relax, read a book, maybe take a walk with his dog, Duke. But from the moment he moved in, something felt off. His next-door neighbor, Margaret Kensington, had been watching him. Not in a friendly way. More like a hawk circling its prey. Every time he stepped outside, she found a reason to be there too, trimming the already perfect hedges, watering flowers that didn't need watering, sweeping a spotless driveway. And every time she stared, Malcolm ignored it. He had dealt with worse. Then, when the Starlink equipment arrived at his doorstep that morning, he knew today wouldn't be easy. Malcolm didn't expect installing a simple Starlink dish to cause problems. He had ordered it a week ago. His work required a fast, stable connection, and satellite internet was the best option in this neighborhood. He had spent years dealing with people like Margaret Kensington in courtrooms, but he wasn't expecting to deal with one at home. He carried the equipment to his backyard, unboxed it, and started assembling the dish. It was a quick job: secure the base, attach the receiver, and get it aligned. He had just finished the setup when he heard the first sign of trouble. "Excuse me." Margaret's voice sliced through the air like a blade. Malcolm closed his eyes for a second, exhaled, and turned to face her. She stood at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, lips pursed. "What is that?" she demanded, nodding toward the dish. Malcolm wiped his hands on his jeans. "It's a Starlink dish. Satellite internet." Margaret frowned. "Why do you need something like that?" Malcolm sighed inwardly. "Here we go. I work from home sometimes," he said simply. "This provides a faster connection." Margaret didn't move. She kept staring at the dish like it was a bomb about to go off. Then she narrowed her eyes. "I don't think you're supposed to have that here," she said. "Our neighborhood has rules." Malcolm crossed his arms. "There's nothing in the HOA guidelines about satellite dishes." "I checked." Margaret's nostrils flared. "You checked?" "Yes. Before I installed it." Margaret took a slow step forward. "I don't know how things were where you lived before, but this is a respectable neighborhood. We don't just install strange, high-tech devices in our yards without consulting the community." Malcolm forced a smile. "It's not high-tech. It's just internet." Margaret scoffed. "Well, I don't like it. And I don't like strange men messing with electrical equipment near my house." There was. Malcolm's smile vanished. He had dealt with racism in many forms: subtle, loud, professional, and unhinged. He knew exactly what was happening here. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm not messing with electrical equipment. I'm installing something on my own property. If you have a problem with it, you can call the HOA." Her face twitched. "Oh, I will. In fact," she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police." Malcolm's expression didn't change. "Go ahead." Margaret hesitated. She had expected him to panic, to get nervous, to apologize, maybe. But Malcolm Evers was a federal judge. He had seen men lie, confess, break down in court. He wasn't intimidated by a woman clutching her phone like a weapon. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then she turned away and started dialing. 15 minutes later, Officer Daniel Hayes got the call. He was sitting in his patrol car, sipping his third coffee of the night, scrolling through his phone. The radio crackled. "Unit 4 to 7, possible disturbance on Willow Lane. Caller reports a suspicious black male tampering with electrical equipment." Hayes' stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. A troublemaker. He put down his coffee and grabbed the radio. "This is Officer Hayes. I'm on my way." He switched on the lights and sped toward Willow Lane. In his mind, the scene was already playing out. A man up to no good, probably lying about what he was doing. Maybe trespassing, maybe breaking into something. Hayes had been a cop long enough to know the signs. By the time he pulled up in front of Margaret Kensington's house, he was ready. He stepped out, rested his hand on his holster, and listened as Margaret breathlessly explained how her suspicious neighbor had been installing some kind of illegal device. Then he turned and saw the man in the driveway. Dark skin, ladder, wires. That was all he needed. His hand moved to his gun. "Sir, step away from whatever it is you're doing. Hands where I can see them." And just like that, everything spiraled. Now, back to the present. The gunshot rang out. A single, deafening bang. For a split second, everything stood still. The sound echoed down the quiet street, bouncing off houses and vanishing into the night. Officer Hayes' breath caught in his throat. His fingers twitched around his gun. Margaret let out a choked gasp, stumbling back, her hands flying to her mouth. And Malcolm Evers, Judge Malcolm Evers, was still standing. He hadn't been shot. Instead, the gunshot had come from inside Malcolm's house. The front door was open now. A shadow moved in the dim light of the foyer. A deep, booming voice rang out. "What the hell is going on out here?" Malcolm turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That," he said, staring Hayes down, "would be my brother." And then, from the doorway, a massive figure stepped forward. Judge Malcolm Evers wasn't the only lawman in the family. His younger brother, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Evers, was standing in the doorway. and he was holding his own badge in the air. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Officer Hayes froze. His stomach dropped to his feet. Margaret's face went pale. And Malcolm? He simply folded his arms, watching Hayes with the gaze of a man who held power, real power. "Now, officer," he said again, voice calm, controlled. "I believe you were about to explain why you had your gun drawn on a federal judge installing internet in his own home?" Hayes felt his throat go dry. This wasn't just a bad call. This was career-ending. This was his worst nightmare. And before he could even think of a way out, Marcus Evers stepped forward. "You should probably call your supervisor," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "Right now." Hayes' hands clenched into fists. His heart pounded. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to do next. Silence hung over the street like a thick fog. Officer Hayes' fingers twitched near his gun, but he didn't move. His mind was racing, gears grinding furiously in search of a way out. A federal judge. An assistant U.S. attorney. He had just pointed a gun at the worst possible people. Margaret Kensington was frozen, her eyes darting between the two black men who now stood in positions of undeniable authority. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. In her mind, the police were supposed to handle situations like this, to make people like Malcolm Evers go away. But instead, her concerned neighbor act had just blown up in her face. "Officer," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "Are you going to call your supervisor, or should I?" Hayes' jaw clenched. He knew the protocol. The moment an incident involved a high-profile individual, especially someone in the legal system, things had to be handled carefully. One wrong move, and this could turn into a scandal. Slowly, stiffly, he reached for his radio. "This is Officer Hayes," he said through gritted teeth. "I need a supervisor at my location. Now." The response was almost immediate. "Copy that, 4-7. Stand by." Malcolm and Marcus exchanged glances. Neither of them looked angry, but that was worse. They weren't yelling, they weren't panicking, they were waiting. And that meant they had already won. Margaret, still clutching her phone, took a shaky step forward. "Officer, I didn't mean for all this to happen," she said quickly. "I was just trying to—" "To what?" Marcus cut in sharply, turning toward her. "What exactly were you trying to do?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had no answer. Malcolm tilted his head. "You called the police on me for installing internet." I thought it was something else," she stammered. "I thought maybe you were tampering with something." Marcus let out a humorless laugh. Tampering with what? His own roof. Hayes took a step back, inhaling deeply, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look," he said, forcing his voice to stay level. "Let's not escalate this any further. The supervisor will be here soon, and we'll get everything sorted out." Malcolm stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly he nodded. "Fine," he said. "We'll wait." The flashing blue lights of another patrol car appeared at the end of the street. Sergeant Matthew Carter pulled up behind Hayes' vehicle, stepping out with an air of authority. He was an older officer, built like a linebacker, with salt and pepper hair and deep-set eyes that had seen too much in his 30 years on the force. He took one look at the scene and immediately sensed trouble. "Hayes," he barked, striding toward him. "What's going on here?" Hayes stiffened. "Suspicious activity call," he said quickly. "White female caller reported." "I can see what happened," Carter cut him off, his sharp gaze shifting between Malcolm and Marcus. His eyes lingered on Malcolm's face, recognition flickering. "Judge Evers." Malcolm folded his arms. "That's right." Carter exhaled slowly, already knowing this was a mess he'd be cleaning up for weeks. Would someone like to explain how this turned into a gun being drawn? Margaret, desperate to reclaim control of the narrative, stepped forward. "Sergeant, I was just trying to do the right thing. He was installing something strange and I didn't know what it was. I thought." "You thought what?" Carter interrupted, his tone sharp. "That he was committing a crime?" Margaret hesitated. You called 911 on a federal judge for setting up internet," Carter said bluntly, rubbing his temples. Mrs. Kensington, do you realize how bad this looks? Margaret's face turned red. I didn't know who he was. Carter shook his head and turned to Hayes. And you? Did you even ask for ID before drawing your weapon? Hayes swallowed. He was reaching for something. Malcolm arched an eyebrow. I was reaching for my wallet. Carter's expression darkened. He had been doing this job long enough to recognize when an officer had made a serious mistake. This is bad, he muttered under his breath. Then, raising his voice, he asked, Judge Evers, how would you like to proceed? Everyone turned to Malcolm. Marcus shifted beside him. That depends, Malcolm said, keeping his voice neutral. What happens next? Carter let out a slow sigh. We write up a report. Internal Affairs gets involved. And Officer Hayes is put on administrative leave while an investigation takes place. Hayes' face paled. Sir. Carter shot him a look. You pulled your weapon on a federal judge. What did you think was going to happen? Margaret let out a small gasp, realizing that this was far worse than she had anticipated. Wait, he's being punished? Carter turned on her. Mrs. Kensington, go home. But. Go. Home. Margaret shut her mouth, looking humiliated, then turned and scurried back inside, slamming her door behind her. Carter looked back at Malcolm. Judge Evers, I know this doesn't change what happened, but I want you to know, this will be handled. Malcolm studied him carefully. I appreciate that, he said. But I'm also going to file a formal complaint. Hayes' heart sank. Carter nodded. Understood. Marcus, who had been quiet until now, smirked slightly. I'll be handling the legal paperwork. Hayes felt like he was standing on a sinking ship. Officer Hayes, Carter said, his tone final. Turn in your weapon. As of now, you're suspended pending review. The words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. His mouth went dry. Sir, Carter held up a hand. Not another word. Hand it over. Slowly, reluctantly, Hayes unclipped his holster and handed over his gun. The weight of it leaving his hands felt like the weight of his entire career slipping away. Carter took it, then gestured to his patrol car. Go sit in the vehicle. Now. Hayes hesitated. His eyes flickered between Malcolm and Marcus, rage simmering under his skin. But he had no choice. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the car. As he opened the door, he stole one last glance at the two men who had just unraveled his entire life. Malcolm Evers was watching him with a look of quiet disappointment. And Marcus? Marcus just smiled. Officer Hayes sat in the patrol car, staring blankly at the dashboard. His mind was a storm of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. He had been a cop for 10 years. He had handled tough situations, made quick calls, and trusted his instincts. And now, because of one bad call, he was suspended? Because of a black man with some stupid internet dish? His fingers curled into fists. Inside the house, Malcolm and Marcus stood at the front door, watching as Sergeant Carter wrapped up the scene. You didn't have to smile like that, Malcolm muttered. Marcus shrugged. Oh, come on. You saw his face. Priceless. Malcolm shook his head, though a small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. You always were the petty one. Marcus chuckled. And you were always the patient one. Maybe too patient. You really think this is the end of it? Malcolm exhaled, glancing toward the patrol car where Hayes Saturday. No, he admitted. I don't. And he was right. This was just the beginning. By morning, word had already started to spread. An officer pulling a gun on a federal judge wasn't just a minor mistake, it was a scandal. The department tried to keep it quiet, but that was impossible. People talked. Reports leaked. And soon, the news hit the press. Local judge confronted at gunpoint in his own home. Racial profiling incident under investigation. Police officer suspended after false 911 call. Margaret Kensington, of course, was horrified. But not for the right reasons. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't remorseful. She was furious. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Sitting in her living room, watching the news coverage, she gritted her teeth. People online were calling her racist. They were saying she had caused this entire mess. that she had weaponized the police against an innocent man. "It's not fair," she muttered. She grabbed her phone and called one of her friends, someone she knew would understand. "This is insane," she hissed. "I did the right thing. I felt something was off, and I trusted my instincts. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" Her friend hesitated. "Margaret, maybe you should just let this go." Margaret's nostrils flared. "No. This isn't over." And with that, she hung up. Meanwhile, at the police department, Officer Hayes sat in a cold, sterile office across from an internal affairs investigator. His hands rested on the table. His career hung in the balance. "Walk me through it again," the investigator said. Hayes swallowed. He knew the routine. He had been on this side of an interrogation before, just never as the suspect. "I got a call about suspicious activity," he began. The caller was concerned about a possible illegal device being installed. The investigator nodded, jotting notes. "And did you verify the nature of the device before drawing your weapon?" Hayes hesitated. I assessed the situation." "Did you verify?" A long pause. "No." The investigator's eyes locked onto him. "Did you identify the suspect before escalating the situation?" Hayes felt heat rising in his chest. He was reaching for something." The investigator leaned forward. "Officer Hayes, let's be clear. You pulled a gun on a federal judge who was installing internet in his own home. And now, this department is under scrutiny. The chief is getting calls from city officials, and people want answers." Hayes clenched his jaw. "I made a judgment call." The investigator stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled. "A judgment call," he repeated. Hayes didn't respond. Finally, the investigator closed his notebook. "I hope it was worth your badge." By the end of the week, protests had erupted outside the police station. People were calling for Hayes to be fired. Some wanted charges filed. On the other side, a small but loud group had emerged in support of Hayes. They claimed he was being unfairly punished, that he was a good cop who had been thrown under the bus. And in the middle of it all, Malcolm Evers remained silent. He hadn't given any public statements. He hadn't fed into the media circus. Instead, he watched. And waited. Because he knew something else was coming. Something worse. It happened 3 weeks later. Malcolm was leaving his house early one morning, heading to his car, when he noticed something strange. A shadow near the side of his house. Someone was there. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he reached for his phone, then stopped when the figure stepped into the light. Officer Hayes. No uniform. No badge. Just him. And the look in his eyes sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. Malcolm Evers' breath slowed. His fingers hovered near his phone, but he didn't move too quickly. Hayes stood just beyond the glow of the porch light, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. There was something unnerving about the way he stood, too still, too composed. "You shouldn't be here," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. Hayes tilted his head slightly, eyes dark with something unreadable. "I just came to talk." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "You came to talk at 5 in the morning? Lurking outside my house?" Hayes took a step forward. "I lost everything because of you." Malcolm didn't move. "No. You lost everything because of yourself." Hayes let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You know, people like you think you've got it all figured out. You think the system actually protects you." His voice dipped lower. "It doesn't. It never has." Malcolm studied him carefully. He had dealt with dangerous men before, some with power, some without. But there was something especially dangerous about a man who had just lost everything and had nowhere else to direct his rage. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Malcolm said quietly. Hayes smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or what?" That was when Malcolm heard it, the faintest rustling sound near the side of his house. His gut clenched. Hayes wasn't alone. His fingers curled around his phone. He wasn't about to turn his back on this man, but he needed to get inside. "Walk away, Hayes," Malcolm said. "Whatever you think you're doing right now. It's not worth it." Hayes just stood there, staring at him, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Then, out of nowhere, the silence was shattered. A sudden loud crack echoed in the distance, something sharp, something violent. A gunshot. Malcolm instinctively ducked, heart hammering against his ribs. Hayes jerked his head in the direction of the sound, looking just as startled. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Malcolm saw it, a figure running from the side of his house, disappearing into the shadows. Who the hell was that? Malcolm demanded, stepping forward. Hayes' face hardened, but he didn't answer. The sound of distant sirens began to fill the air. Someone must have heard the shot and called it in. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He backed toward his door, eyes locked on Hayes the entire time. He wasn't about to turn his back. "Leave," Malcolm ordered. Hayes didn't move. The sirens grew louder. Finally, Hayes took a slow step backward. Then another. And without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night. Malcolm didn't let out his breath until he was safely inside, locking the door behind him. His mind was racing. Who had fired that shot? And more importantly, was Hayes just a pawn in something even bigger? By the time police arrived, the street was already buzzing with activity. Neighbors peered through blinds. Flashing lights painted the quiet suburb in streaks of red and blue. Malcolm was inside, pacing his living room, when Marcus arrived. "What the hell happened?" Marcus asked, his voice low and urgent. Malcolm turned to him, his expression grim. "Hayes was here." Marcus stiffened. "Did he threaten you?" "No. Not directly. But he wasn't alone. Someone was outside my house." Marcus' face darkened. "They shot at you?" Malcolm shook his head. "No. It wasn't aimed at me." He glanced toward the window. "I think it was meant to distract. To send a message." Marcus ran a hand over his face. "This isn't good, Mal. If Hayes is desperate enough to show up at your house in the middle of the night, that means he's got nothing left to lose." Malcolm sat down heavily. "I know." A long silence stretched between them. Then Marcus leaned in. "We need to find out who else was out there." Malcolm met his brother's eyes. He knew exactly what Marcus was suggesting. They weren't going to just sit back and wait. It was time to go on the offensive. The next day, Malcolm made a call. It wasn't to the police. It wasn't to his legal team. It was to someone else. Someone who operated outside the system. A few hours later, a man arrived at his doorstep. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much. His name was Daniel Ross, ex-FBI, now a private investigator. "You're in trouble," Daniel said the moment he stepped inside. Malcolm didn't flinch. "Tell me something I don't know." Daniel sat down across from him. "I did some digging. Hayes has been making some calls. Reaching out to some interesting people." Malcolm narrowed his eyes. "What kind of people?" Daniel exhaled. "The kind who don't like judges who file complaints against cops." A heavy silence settled over the room. Marcus let out a slow curse. "So, it's not just Hayes." Daniel shook his head. "No. And if I had to guess? That shot last night? That wasn't random." He leaned forward. "Someone's trying to scare you." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "That's not going to happen." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said. "Because they're just getting started." 2 days later, Malcolm's car was vandalized. Slashed tires. Broken windows. A note left on the windshield. "Drop the complaint. Or next time, IT won't be your car." Malcolm stared at the words, his blood running cold. It was clear now. This wasn't just about Hayes anymore. This was bigger. And whoever was behind it, they were willing to go a lot further to make sure he stayed quiet. Malcolm stood by his car, fists clenched. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the street, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the shattered glass, the deep slashes in the tires, and, most of all, the note on his windshield. "Drop the complaint. Or next time, IT won't be your car." He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had seen threats before. As a federal judge, he had ruled on high-stakes cases. Drug cartels, corporate fraud, even organized crime. He knew what intimidation looked like. But this was different. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about a criminal empire protecting its interests. This was about hatred. This was about a system that protected men like Hayes and punished men like him for daring to push back. Footsteps approached behind him. Marcus. He let out a low whistle. Them. They really wanted to send a message, huh? Malcolm didn't respond. Marcus bent down, picking up the note and scanning it. His expression darkened. They think this is gonna scare you? He shook his head. They don't know you very well. Malcolm turned to him, voice level. No. But they do know the system. Marcus frowned. Meaning they're betting on the fact that the people who are supposed to protect me won't. A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus exhaled. So, what's the move? Malcolm didn't hesitate. We don't wait. We hit first. Marcus smirked. Now you're talking. Daniel Ross showed up an hour later. The former FBI agent walked around the car, inspecting the damage. When he reached the note, he let out a quiet chuckle. Amateurs, he muttered. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. You find something funny about this? Daniel straightened, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. I find it sloppy. Slashed tires? Broken windows? A handwritten threat. He shook his head. This wasn't some carefully planned operation. This was personal. Emotional. Which means... Marcus leaned forward. Which means what? Daniel smirked. Which means they left breadcrumbs. Daniel's contacts moved fast. Within hours, he had surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. The video was grainy, but it was clear enough. Two men. One wearing a hoodie, the other in a baseball cap. The timestamp? Less than 10 minutes before Malcolm's car was vandalized. Daniel played the footage in slow motion. Recognize them? Marcus narrowed his eyes. The guy in the hoodie. I swear I've seen him before. Malcolm studied the screen. Then his stomach tightened. He had seen him before, too. The man in the hoodie had been at the protest outside the police station, standing with the group defending Officer Hayes. Marcus exhaled sharply. They're really out here doing his dirty work? Daniel leaned back. Looks that way. He tapped the screen. And that means we have a lead. Malcolm's jaw clenched. Then let's use it. That night, Daniel made a few calls. He knew people who knew people. And soon enough, he had a name. Brandon Lutz. Dishonorably discharged. And, unsurprisingly, a known associate of Officer Hayes. Figures, Marcus muttered when Daniel shared the intel. Malcolm folded his arms. Where is he now? Daniel smirked. Funny you ask. He slid his phone across the table. On the screen was a photo, grainy, but clear enough. Brandon Lutz. Sitting at a dive bar on the outskirts of town. Marcus grinned. Road trip. Malcolm's expression darkened. Road trip. The bar smelled like stale beer and bad decisions. Malcolm, Marcus, and Daniel walked in together, scanning the dimly lit room. And there he was. Brandon Lutz sat at a corner table, laughing with a few other men. His baseball cap was pulled low over his face, but there was no mistaking him. Marcus cracked his knuckles. You want to handle this quietly, or? Malcolm shot him a look. Let's see if he's willing to talk first. They approached the table. Lutz glanced up, and his smile immediately vanished. His body tensed. Brandon, Malcolm said, voice even. Lutz looked between the three men, weighing his options. I don't know you. Malcolm smirked. Sure you do. He pulled out his phone and held up the gas station footage. Now, how about we talk? Lutz's eyes darted around the bar. He was looking for an escape route. Daniel leaned down. I wouldn't, he said softly. Lutz swallowed. Then, to Malcolm's surprise, he smiled. You think you've got me? Lutz said, leaning back in his chair. You think this is gonna scare me? Malcolm narrowed his eyes. I don't need to scare you, Brandon. I just need you to tell me who sent you. Lutz chuckled. And if I don't? Malcolm didn't blink. Then I make sure every cop in this city knows that the only reason you're not behind bars right now is because you're too stupid to cover your tracks. Lutz's smile faltered. For the first time, real uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Malcolm pressed forward. Last chance. Who sent you? Lutz hesitated. Then, finally, he exhaled and leaned in. You think Hayes is your only problem? He muttered. You're in way deeper than you realize. A chill ran down Malcolm's spine. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Meaning? Lutz glanced around again, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, in a hushed voice, he said, There's a group watching you. Hayes is just the tip of the iceberg. Malcolm's fingers tightened around his phone. Who? Lutz shook his head. I don't know all the details. Lutz's voice dropped lower. I don't know all the details, but I know this. It's bigger than Hayes. He licked his lips, his eyes darting between Malcolm, Marcus, and Daniel. There's a group. Cops, ex-cops, people in high places. They've been watching you since the complaint. Malcolm's heartbeat thudded in his ears. Names. Lutz let out a dry laugh. Yeah, I'm not that stupid. The only reason I'm still breathing is because I don't ask questions. Marcus slammed his hands down on the table, making Lutz flinch. You don't get to play games. Someone fired a shot outside my brother's house. Was that part of the plan? Lutz shook his head quickly. No, man. That wasn't me. He exhaled sharply. Listen, you think I want to be in this mess? You think I want to be running errands for a bunch of racist psychos? He leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. But here's the thing, Judge. They don't just go after you. They go after families, friends. And if you don't back down, they make you disappear. Silence. Daniel's eyes were locked on Lutz, studying every twitch, every flicker of movement. If you're so scared of them, he said, voice level, why are you talking to us? Lutz hesitated. Then, finally, he muttered, because I know what's coming next. Malcolm stiffened. What do you mean? Lutz swallowed hard. They're planning something. And it's not just about scaring you anymore. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. You pissed off the wrong people, Judge. They're not gonna stop at threats. Marcus clenched his fists. So what are they planning? Lutz hesitated again. Then, just as he opened his mouth, the front door of the bar exploded inward. A masked man stormed in, shotgun in hand. Shouting. Screaming. People diving for cover. Malcolm's instincts kicked in fast. He grabbed Marcus and yanked him down behind the table. Daniel moved quicker than anyone, drawing his gun in one smooth motion. Lutz panicked. Oh, hell no. A second shotgun blast tore through the bar, shattering bottles behind the counter. The shooter wasn't random. He was coming straight for them. Daniel fired first. A sharp, controlled shot. The shooter jerked back, his shoulder bursting red. He staggered, but he didn't go down. Malcolm didn't waste time. He grabbed Lutz by the collar. Time to go. Lutz, still stunned, barely moved. Marcus had to drag him toward the back exit. Daniel covered them, firing another shot. The shooter stumbled again, but this time, he turned and ran. Seconds later, he was gone. The bar was in chaos. People were screaming, knocking over chairs, ducking under tables. But Malcolm wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about one thing. That shooter had come for Lutz. And if they were willing to kill one of their own, that meant Malcolm was next. They got out fast. Malcolm, Marcus, Daniel, and Lutz piled into Malcolm's car, speeding away before the cops arrived. Lutz was shaking. You see that? You see that? I told you, man. These guys don't play around. Malcolm ignored him. Daniel. Daniel was already on his phone. Yeah. I'll find out who the shooter was. Malcolm gritted his teeth. Do it fast. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. We're being followed. Malcolm's grip on the wheel tightened. How many cars? Just one. Daniel twisted in his seat. Dark SUV. Tinted windows. He exhaled. They're professionals. Malcolm's mind raced. He couldn't lead them back to his house. Couldn't risk them finding his family. Hang on, he muttered, yanking the wheel. The tires screeched as they took a hard left down a side street. The SUV followed. Daniel pulled out his gun. If they get close, I'm taking the shot. Malcolm didn't respond. His focus was on the road. Fast turns. Sharp angles. Narrow alleys. But the SUV didn't lose them. Whoever was behind the wheel knew exactly what they were doing. Lutz was hyperventilating. Oh, hell no. Hell no, man. They're gonna kill me. Marcus snapped, shut up. Then out of nowhere, the SUV sped up and rammed into their back bumper. The impact nearly sent them spinning. Malcolm gritted his teeth, fighting for control. Daniel cursed. They're trying to force us off the road. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the GPS. There was a freeway ramp a few blocks ahead. If he could just press. The SUV rammed them again. This time, the car skidded dangerously close to a row of parked vehicles. Marcus grabbed the dashboard. You better have a plan, Mal. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Working on it. Daniel turned. Screw it. He rolled down the window, aimed, and fired. Bang. Bang. The SUV swerved violently. Then, tires screeching. It slammed into a street pole. The sound of metal crunching filled the air. Malcolm didn't stop to check if they were dead. He hit the gas and kept going. They didn't stop until they were miles away. Finally, when he was sure they weren't being followed, Malcolm pulled into an empty parking lot and killed the engine. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus let out a breathless laugh. Oh, that was fun. Malcolm glared at him. You call that fun? Marcus shrugged. Hey, I wasn't bored. Lutz, still shaking, buried his face in his hands. I'm dead. I'm so dead. Daniel reloaded his gun. No, but you're definitely out of time. Malcolm turned to Lutz. You need to talk. Now. Lutz hesitated. Then finally he let out a slow breath. There's a name, he muttered. I don't know all the details, but I heard it more than once. Malcolm leaned in. Who? Lutz swallowed hard. Then in a whisper he said, Sheriff Langley. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Marcus stiffened. Wait, Langley? As in? Yeah, Lutz muttered. The guy who runs half the department. He exhaled. He's the one pulling the strings. Silence. Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief second. If Lutz was telling the truth, this wasn't just some rogue cops acting on their own. This was a coordinated operation. And the man in charge of it? Was the sheriff himself. Malcolm stared at Lutz, his mind racing. Sheriff Langley. The man who controlled most of the police force. The man who had built a career on being tough on crime. The man whose hands were in every major decision in the city. If he was behind this, then Malcolm wasn't just fighting a few bad cops. He was fighting the entire system. Marcus let out a low whistle. Damn. Daniel exhaled sharply. That explains a lot. Lutz nodded, rubbing his face. Yeah. And now you get why I didn't want to talk. Malcolm folded his arms. How deep does this go? Lutz hesitated. Then finally he muttered, deep. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Define deep. Lutz exhaled. Langley's been running things for years. Some of his guys? They're not even on the payroll. They're just people who owe him. He shook his head. You think Hayes is bad? He's just a pawn. The real power? That's Langley. Silence. Malcolm clenched his jaw. If the sheriff was behind this, then there was no going to the police. No asking for backup. If Langley wanted Malcolm gone, then there was nowhere safe. Marcus finally spoke. So what's the move? Malcolm's voice was ice cold. We take the fight to him. Malcolm knew they couldn't just walk up to Langley and accuse him. They needed proof. They needed leverage. Malcolm's mind was already working ahead. Sheriff Langley was too powerful to take down with just words. If they wanted to bring him down, they needed proof, hard evidence that could expose him. But that also meant one thing. They had to bait him out. Marcus leaned forward, eyes sharp. You're serious? You want to go after the most dangerous man in this city? The guy who runs half the cops? You know how that ends, right? Malcolm's jaw tightened. If we don't, it won't just be me. It'll be anyone who speaks up. Anyone who doesn't fall in line. You think they're just gonna let this go? Lutz groaned, rubbing his temples. Y'all are crazy. You know that, right? Daniel ignored him. What's the plan? Malcolm exhaled, his fingers tapping against the car's dashboard. We need something that forces Langley to react. Something he won't ignore. Lutz shook his head. Man, you don't get it. He doesn't react. He doesn't need to. People do it for him. Daniel frowned. Then we make sure he has to get involved himself. Marcus smirked. And how exactly do we do that? Malcolm's eyes narrowed. We hit him where it hurts. The first step was information. They needed to know everything about Langley. His habits, his allies, his weaknesses. So they split up. Daniel started pulling police records, looking for patterns in cases where Langley had too much influence. Marcus reached out to old contacts, trying to find anyone who had dirt on the sheriff. Malcolm dug into legal cases connected to Langley, searching for anything suspicious. And Lutz, well, he didn't have much of a choice but to help. He still had ties inside the department. If anyone could find out what Langley was up to, it was him. For 2 days, they worked in the shadows. Then finally, Lutz called Malcolm in a panic. Man, we got a problem. Malcolm's stomach tightened. What is it? Lutz's voice was shaky. Langley knows. Malcolm's blood ran cold. Lutz continued, voice low. He knows you're looking into him. And he's already moving. Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. Moving how? Lutz swallowed hard. He's sending someone after you. Malcolm didn't go home that night. He knew what was coming. Langley wouldn't send another squad car. Wouldn't make another sloppy move like Hayes. This time, he'd send a professional. A hunter. And Malcolm was the prey. Marcus and Daniel stayed close, but Malcolm knew the truth. This fight was personal. Langley wouldn't stop until Malcolm was gone. So when Malcolm saw the black SUV parked outside his office the next morning, he knew. They were here. The door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, built like a tank. Wearing a suit, but the kind that didn't belong in a courtroom. And on his hip? A gun. Marcus muttered, "We got company." Daniel exhaled. "You ready for this?" Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on the man. Then, with a slow breath, he muttered, "Let's find out." The man from the SUV didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone said everything. He was here for Malcolm. To end this. Marcus muttered, "We should go." But Malcolm didn't move. He wouldn't run. Not now. The man approached, his steps slow and deliberate. When he finally stopped a few feet away, he pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with steady hands. Then, in a calm voice, he said, "Judge Malcolm Porter." Malcolm kept his expression blank. "Depends on who's asking." The man smirked. "Langley sends his regards." "A warning." Malcolm clenched his fists. "Tell Langley if he wanted to threaten me, he should have come himself." The man chuckled, taking a drag from his cigarette. "You don't get it, do you?" He exhaled a cloud of smoke. "This isn't a threat." Then, without warning, he reached for his gun. Bang! Marcus fired first. The bullet grazed the man's arm, making him stumble back, but he didn't go down. Bang! Bang! Daniel fired next, aiming for the man's chest, but he was already moving. Malcolm barely had time to react before the man charged. A fist slammed into Malcolm's ribs, knocking the breath out of him. Malcolm staggered, but he didn't fall. A punch to the jaw. A knee to the gut. He slammed the man against a parked car. But the man was too strong. He broke free, swinging his gun toward Malcolm's head. Daniel tackled him from the side, knocking the gun loose. It clattered to the ground. Marcus kicked it away. The man roared, shoving Daniel off. Turn back to Malcolm. But Malcolm was ready. With every ounce of strength left in his body, he threw one last punch. And the man collapsed. Unconscious. Malcolm's breathing was ragged. His ribs ached. His knuckles throbbed. But he was alive. Marcus wiped his face, shaking his head. "Tell me we're done with this." Daniel checked the man's pockets, pulling out a phone. "We're not done." "Not yet." Malcolm took the phone and scrolled through the messages. And there it was. A text from Langley himself. "Make sure the judge doesn't walk away from this." It was proof. Proof that Langley had ordered a hit. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "We got him." Lutz, who had been hiding behind the car the whole time, peeked out. "We got him." Marcus grinned. "Oh, we got him." Daniel was already dialing a number. FBI's gonna love this. Malcolm leaned back against the car, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. Langley was done. And for the first time in a long time, Malcolm finally felt safe. Langley was arrested within 24 hours. The evidence on the phone was undeniable. With Lutz's testimony and the FBI's involvement, Langley's entire operation collapsed. Dozens of corrupt officers were exposed. Hayes was convicted. The city finally saw the truth. Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, watching as Langley was led away in handcuffs. Marcus nudged him. "So, what now?" Malcolm took a deep breath. "Now." He exhaled, smiling slightly. "I go back to doing my job." Daniel chuckled. "Just another day for a federal judge, huh?" Malcolm smirked. "Something like that." As Langley was shoved into the police car, Malcolm turned away. It was over. Justice had won. And this time, nobody was above the law.